ado, I will pass it off to Allie.
Okay, so as she said, I'm Allie Glenn. I actually live in Muscatine, which, if you guys know anything about the Mississippi River, we're the nose of the Mississippi, as I refer to it. We actually got started as an industrial city, and this right here you'll see is the Mississippi River, which is where, if you'll switch to the next slide real quick, then we have how Muscatine got founded, which was clam buttons. And so we've always been industry, and since then, factories, meat packing plants, you name it, we've had it. And so clean air, environmental aspects, all of that has been huge, huge, huge in Muscatine. If you go to the next slide, there we go. This one is what we're most infamous for, the Grain Processing Corp, or as we call it, GPC. It actually has been in the news quite a bit, especially recently, because of the amount of pollution that was put into the air from the GPC. Luckily, we did have quite a few of our residents who kind of took arms and decided to come together and band together to help Muscatine clean up their act, and get GPC to kind of modify all of their machines and all of their things so that our air would be a lot cleaner. So why is this such a big deal for us? Obviously, me as a mom, I have 2 children of my own, and you can see in this picture just how close that GPC plant is to an elementary school, to the parks, to residences. I mean, it is right next door. It is our not so friendly neighborhood back then, neighborhood friend. So one of the things that I've always been passionate about is clean air and environmental work. And ever since I started as a very young girl, you knew not to go anywhere near this area, because not only was it kind of a gritty atmosphere, but it smelled like rotten eggs. And if any of you know the smell of rotten eggs, it is not something that you want to have anywhere in your neighborhood. So property values went down. You didn't want to go anywhere towards those parks. You didn't want to live in this area. And so unfortunately, the south end of town, which is where this is primarily located, was kind of off limits to a lot of us. So that being said, as I was growing, we knew about this problem, but nothing was really being done until a lot of people banded together and did a class action suit. So when I finally decided that my children needed to have a better environment for them to grow up in, it was a little bit too late, because my family, unfortunately, has now a ton of health problems. We have asthma, we have heart problems, we have significant developmental delays in my youngest son. You name it, and we have it. We are, unfortunately, kind of a textbook, within that textbook percentage of what happens when you have pollution. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit of what it used to look like back then. Renee, can I get the next slide, please? There we go. So this is obviously in kind of the colder area, but this is a very good representation of what it looked like outside of my window when I was growing up. And it's not something that you wanted to see. And when I had my first son, I was also living there. And so my first son was exposed to this as well. So what did I decide to do? Of course, I decided I wanted to be an environmental activist. I was not going to settle for this. I was abhorrent of all of these pollution and all of the atrocities that was occurring to us, because most people, they smell it, but they don't realize exactly what it is that they're inhaling. They don't realize about all these teeny tiny particles that are in the air. And so most people don't realize how important it really is. So I ended up actually studying environmental science, and I studied pollution, and I studied, all these things in order to have the background to be able to really advocate for it. Eventually, we ended up having a myriad of organizations here in Muscatine that are now fighting for everyone. Clean Air Muscatine is one of them that is pretty common when you look up the GPC settlement now. And we also have a couple more that I now chair, hoping to get a little bit more, not just clean air, but also, water pollution and just all of it. All of it needs to be cleaned up since we are such a heavily industrial city. So if you go to the next slide, this right here, this shows you exactly how close it is to our residents. I mean, it's literally right next door to us. So it's a very, very, very big problem here in Muscatine. Luckily, we did win. We won our class action suit, and this company in particular did have to clean up their act, kind of, if you will. And fortunately, our particulate matter and everything in the air has gone down significantly. And when you go to South End, it doesn't really smell like rotten fish anymore, or rotten eggs, if you will. And it's huge. Unfortunately, like I said, it was a little bit too little too late, because no matter how much we get paid, it doesn't make a difference to our lungs. Our lungs aren't going to get paid and all of a sudden they're healthy. And it doesn't work like that. So we are still struggling with health problems. And I was actually laughing because your previous slide where it had the inhaler with the chamber and everything, we are very familiar with that here in our household. My youngest son is actually on 10 different medications, and he's not allowed outside when it's under 10 or under 40 degrees, sorry. He's not allowed if there's a certain particulate matter in the air, if there's pollen count, a certain number. He's never played in the snow, you name it. Unfortunately, that's our life. And so it's definitely something that people need to take into consideration, and it's 100% something that's worth fighting for, because you don't realize how much it's going to affect you and your family, and you don't realize how much you're inhaling into yourself and inhaling into your lungs, and how much your lungs are going to reject that either now or in the future. So I'm a hardcore advocate, that's me, not only for myself and for my people, but I have a little one that I have to look in the face and I have to say, yes, I am fighting for you. And yes, I am trying very hard so that other children and other people don't have the same health problems that he does. So. Karen, were you going to say something also?
Yes, it's a good moment, Angie.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. But yes, you can have a minute to talk about Mom's Clean Air Force.
I just didn't know if this was a good moment or if you'd like me to say something later.
Now it's good.
Okay. My name is Karin Stein, and I am the field organizer for Mom's Clean Air Force, on whose behalf Ali just spoke. I just want to put Ali's comments in a couple of very important contexts. First of all, we're in the middle of fighting a worldwide pandemic. And so first and foremost, we're thinking about families who are affected by this at all levels. And as we fight for clean air, in the bigger context of this, let me just point out that, coronavirus is something that affects our breathing organ, the lungs primarily. And so imagine if you have these kinds of problems, if you live in an area where your lungs are constantly irritated, what that will do to your ability to fight a pandemic. You're already from the get-go at a huge disadvantage to the rest of us who might not have breathing problems or who might have the privilege of living in cleaner areas. So I just wanted to put that in the context of what's going on right now. And the other part of this is, what is happening at the EPA? The EPA is supposed to protect us from particles. It's supposed to protect us from pollution. It is supposed to protect the vulnerable and give them a good chance, like the rest of us who are healthier are enjoying. Instead, what we're seeing is that Andrew Wheeler is gutting everything he can gut, just now, hot off the press, this afternoon, a ruling was introduced that will most likely weaken mercury and toxic standards, MATs. He rolled back clean car regulation. He is he's proposing to weaken a particle pollution legislation. He's giving waivers to polluting industries. So right in the middle of this pandemic, because we're distracted, Andrew Wheeler, who moms believe just has to go, is hurting the very people he and his institution is supposed to protect, like Allie and her family. I just wanted to put that in a bigger worldwide perspective, and also point out that minorities are disproportionately affected in Iowa. I mean, 6% of Iowans are of Latino origin, yet they are 16% of the COVID-19 cases, and that has to do with where they work and what they breathe, in part. Same with African Americans. So if you'd like to find out more about how to reach Allie or how to reach me, the slide right there, take a picture of it. Please reach out. We're a reliable force of information. We're a nationwide organization of over 1 million members fighting for the health of our children and against air pollution and the effects of a changing climate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinne. And those are, yeah, really important points. I hadn't heard about that this afternoon yet, but it all ties in. So thank you again, both Allie and Corinne. And then we'll move on to Audrey now, who will talk to us a little bit more about air quality and public health, and how air quality affects our health scientifically.
Great. Thanks, Angie. And thank you so much, Allie, for that great presentation. I would have to echo what you said about, you know, your family sort of being the textbook case for why air pollution is really important to public health. I think that, you know, this is set up really perfectly. There's a lot of, I'm going to be giving a lot of the background to sort of why it is that young folks are particularly vulnerable to a lot of these air pollutions and sort of how that manifests. It's just going to sound eerily similar to what it looks like in your family, Allie. So yes, hi everybody. My name is Audrey. I am the Environmental Health Program Manager at the University of Northern Iowa Center for Energy and Environmental Education. My work primarily deals with the intersection of ecological health and human health, which, lucky for me, or maybe unlucky for me, spans quite a large continuum. But air quality is definitely under the category of things that I care quite deeply about, and absolutely has a lot to do with ecological health as well. I didn't realize how much that I had to tell you until I was putting the slide deck together. So I'm just going to dive right in, and hopefully I can get to the end without spending too much time on stuff. Angie, if you want to wave at me if I start to take too long, please do that, because I think that I have a tendency to ramble a little bit. Okay, so Renee, I got to the next slide, please. Just so that we don't get lost, here's my outline. I'm going to try to go quickly over the types of air quality hazards, the impacts on human health, and Iowa-specific concerns. I would ideally like for me to spend an equal amount of time on each of these, but we'll see how things go. I'm noticing also that Iowa is pink in this picture. It should be white, so I'm a little bit worried about how the rest of the slides are going to look. We'll find out. So can I do the next slide, Renee? Thank you. So I wanted to start out with what we're actually monitoring at the federal level. So on the right side of the screen, I have a picture of a map that I took from the airnow.gov website, which is, you know, where you can look at air pollution in real time as evaluated by the combination of PM and O3, so particulate matter and ozone. I took this screenshot on Tuesday. If you go to the airnow.gov website, it looks totally different. I have used this website for years and years, and it's always looked like this. And now it's gorgeous. It's super high-tech looking. It looks a little bit different, but it's still the same information. If you would progress the slide, Renee. So if you'll notice, oops, go back one. If you'll notice, go back one. Thank you, right there, keep it there. So if you'll notice at the bottom there where that arrow is pointing, we have a ranking system that shows the how good the air quality is. So if you zoom in on Iowa on this map here, it'll give you a ranking of the region. It'll tell you if it's good air quality, if it's moderate. Orange is unsafe for sensitive groups, and it goes on for more and more unhealthy. There is some evidence, and it's outlined really nicely in the Troubled Air Report, that it sort of questions the safety of these categories that the EPA has promulgated, right? So there's some evidence saying that these thresholds may actually be too high. So what is good air quality might, and in reality, from a public health perspective, be moderate. And likewise, moderate might be at that point where it's unsafe for sensitive groups. Sensitive groups are, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions, children, those who are a little bit more vulnerable than the rest of us. And there is some consensus in the literature that, when it comes to ozone or particulate matter, there really is no limit of safe exposure. So having a high threshold for particulate matter, for example, may already be sort of a ridiculous threshold, because it might not be safe for us to be around the fine particles at all. So shifting our gaze to the left side of the screen, there's a list of EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS, and they have 6 criteria pollutants, which means these are the things that the federal government has said, we can't have too much of this in our air. I've bolded ozone and particulate matter because that's what this map is showing, but also because they're sort of implicated in public health as being kind of like the worst offenders of the things that we monitor. A lot of these pollutants are gaseous, so carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide. Lead is, of course, a heavy metal. Ozone is kind of interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why it's interesting in the next couple slides. And then particulate matter is sort of, I like to think about it as its own beast. But let's move on, Renee. We can go to the next slide. I tricked myself when I was putting this last slide together, like, oh, 6 pollutants, that's kind of okay, right? We can manage 6 pollutants, that's no problem. Sounds like the federal government has a good handle on it. Well, no, hold on, hold your horses. There are plenty of air pollutants that are harmful to human health but aren't currently regulated by the FDA. So for example, things like bacteria and other pathogens, hydrogen sulfide or H2S, volatile organic compounds, VOCs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, POPs, persistent organic pollutants, pesticides, other heavy metals, other toxins, and I really could go on. There's a pretty extensive list of things that we really shouldn't be breathing in from a public health perspective. That's not to say that other regions or states have their own guidelines for what they want to be monitoring, but the federal government has stopped at those 6 criteria pollutants. I have little asterisks next to 3 of these, so bacteria, hydrogen sulfide, and pesticides, because I see those as being particularly important in the Iowa context, and hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that later. So if we progress the slide, it's not good news, basically. Okay, thank you. So ozone, like I mentioned, ozone is kind of an interesting beast in and of itself. Ozone is not something that we pollute directly. It's not coming out of our tailpipes, and it's not coming out of smokestacks. Ozone is a product of other pollutants. So when volatile organic compounds, which really is an umbrella term for a lot of different compounds, and reacts with oxides of nitrogen, and when it gets warm enough for those volatile organic compounds to really volatilize, it creates ozone. And ground level ozone is not like atmospheric ozone. Atmospheric ozone is protective, right? It keeps harmful UV rays away from us. But ground level ozone is really, really harmful to our airways. It causes inflammation and can cause permanent damage if you're exposed to it for long periods of time. It can also exacerbate pre-existing conditions like emphysema, COPD, asthma. So on days where there's heavy ozone in the air, that's when these vulnerable populations are a lot more at risk. Next slide. Oh, actually, just progress. There's like this little note here I want to mention. Thank you. So fine particulate matter is something that does not stay put. Fine particles travel hundreds and hundreds of miles. So, just because you're living in an area that may not have a lot of industry, maybe it doesn't burn any fossil fuels for power, maybe you have fairly good air quality, we all share the same air. These particles move around a lot and can react with other particles in the air. So even though you might not be proximally close to the source, it's still really important for us to be worried about air pollution wherever it's happening. Next slide. Thanks, Renee. So that's the perfect segue to particulate matter. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the terms PM10 and PM2.5. The numbers just denote the size of the particles. I love the diagram on the left, right? It shows how big these particles actually are in comparison to very tiny things. PM10, which is the size of more natural particles like dust, pollen, mold, etc. Those tend to land in the upper respiratory tract. So if you look at the right side of the screen here, where we've got this cross section of a band cut in half, this poor guy who's also blue. If you see the numbers 2 and 3, that's where PM10 tends to lodge in our bodies, right? And we have a fairly good defense mechanism against these particles, right? We can cough and sneeze them out. So while those are important sources of triggers for severe types of asthma, the particle size that we're really worried about is this PM2.5, and those are byproducts of more man-made activity. So they're very ultra-fine particles, and they can you can respire them deep into your lungs, where the alveoli are. And that's where the gas exchange in the body takes place. So that's where red blood cells roll up into the lungs to get refueled with oxygen and distribute that oxygen throughout the body. So that hopefully is triggering some red flags for you all. If that's where blood and oxygen are interacting, that's also the place where air pollution can enter the bloodstream. So just like what Ali was saying in her talk, we have this mechanism, this biological mechanism for which air pollution impacts two main systems of the body, right? Our pulmonary system and our cardiovascular system, right? So unsurprisingly, that's where a lot of the literature shows that from the public health side of things, where we see the most damage. So let's go ahead and talk about those public health harms. Thanks, Renee. So first and foremost, the trouble in the air report is fantastic because it's very tedious to go through large bodies of scientific literature, and I'm sure that Morgan is like emphatically nodding her head here, but I thought it was a really well done report because it summarizes in very plain language some of the main public health harms. So first of all, premature death obviously is something that we're worried about. Or just around 107,000 deaths in the United States every year are attributable to bad air quality. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, that a lot of that has to do with damage to the respiratory and cardiovascular system. And if you look at the data, we see that emergency room visits for cardiovascular events like stroke, heart attack, heart failure increase on days with high air pollution. I had mentioned this before, that ozone causes a lot of inflammation in the airways and it exacerbates a lot of pre-existing respiratory conditions, but it's also been implicated in actually the development of asthma. So, you know, you may be predisposed genetically to get asthma as a kid. That might show up later in your life. But ozone has been, you know, it's looking like ozone can actually cause a perfectly healthy child to have asthma. And that's a lifelong disease that this individual has to deal with. There's also an increased risk of cancer. Some outdoor air pollutants have been shown to be carcinogenic, and that does include fine particulate matter. And we can go on to the next slide because I want to spend some time talking about children and why they're vulnerable. So a lot of the work that I do at the CEEE has to do with children's environmental health. So this is a topic that I'm pretty intimately familiar with, and I feel like it's a refrain that I say almost every day, but children are especially vulnerable, right? And especially to environmental toxins. You know, when we're born, we are not done cooking. We still have a lot of development to do. We are hurtling through these very critical phases of development, and if those developmental phases are interrupted by external toxins, air pollution, what have you, that can mean some negative things later on in life in terms of chronic disease development as an adult. So we want to keep kids, in particular, safe and healthy. But it may also be something that we need to worry about before they're born. So prenatal exposure to pollution has been associated with impaired lung function and impaired lung development in childhood, right? We're born, our lungs are still developing. Our brains are still folding, our kidneys are still developing their nephrons. We still have a long ways to go. So keeping the child as, healthy and protected inside and outside of the womb is really important for their overall health trajectory. But there's also something that we have to worry about the mothers as well. So there's some evidence that there are decreases in fertility and harm to pregnancy in women of childbearing age or those who are expecting. Over 40,000 preterm births in North America, so the United States and Canada, were related to PM 2.5. And that's 10% of all preterm births. Low birth weight and preterm births are especially worrisome because, again, that sets you up for your health for the rest of your life. So that's something that we want to keep an eye on. I was a little bit surprised to see that this wasn't in the report, but I work a lot with pesticides, and so this is something that I've spent a lot of time looking at the literature for. But air pollution and pesticides are some of the two most implicated environmental factors when it comes to the rising rates of autism. So that's something that I'm also keeping an eye on from a public health perspective, and that's very worrisome, especially with how long our air has been polluted. Just to put it into perspective, at this point in time, we are able to link cancer, a disease with a very, very long latency period, to air pollution. That means our air has been polluted long enough for those studies to be done and those correlations to be made, which is heartbreaking. So the bottom line here is that vulnerable populations are made more vulnerable by air pollution, especially particulate matter, and I should write here also, especially ozone. If you could progress the slide. That has been covered. The issue with COVID has been covered by Karen, so we'll go ahead and skip that one. And actually, I'll have you progress to the next part of this slide. Yeah, keep it here. So because my area of expertise is that public health side of things, and looking at coal burning power plants and coal emissions is outside of my wheelhouse. I really had to do some research on this kind of thing because I wanted to provide some Iowa context to this as well. So this Clean Air Task Force resource, perhaps the folks at Environment Iowa are familiar with this. This was new to me. You'll have to tell me if it's reputable. But it breaks down the criteria pollutants per year per site. I'm zooming in here. I'm Googling in here from Cedar Rapids. So I decided to pick on us to see what's going on here. And if you look at the health impacts per year for this one coal power plant, Prairie Creek, you'll see that 8 deaths a year are attributable to this, and over a year of workdays lost, and then a whole host of other things. This is astronomical. In public health dollars, this is hundreds of thousands of dollars spent every year from the fallout of what's going on at this one site. But I'm going to have you move on because there's a couple other things that I want to mention when it comes to Iowa. So the Trouble in the Air report also very rightly so talks about ammonia and agriculture as being important sources of fine particulate matter, that PM 2.5. And I think this is often overlooked as a problem for air pollution. I love this report here, the air quality related health damages of maize. It looks at corn production and how many deaths are associated with how we farm in the United States. Obviously, since 14 million of our 28 or so million farmable acres in Iowa are devoted to corn every year, this is a problem. So 4,300 premature deaths are associated with corn production in the United States. Very expensive, and a lot of that has to do with the PM 2.5 from ammonia from nitrogen fertilizer. Another thing that we have a lot of in Iowa are hogs. So I'm also very worried about bacteria pathogens, and hydrogen sulfide. So we have evidence that these things are not good to be around, and there are some also underserved minority communities that are particularly influenced by a lot of these things. My work at the center, I do child environmental health and I do agricultural health. So these things, I might be a little biased, but I think they're really important. We can move on to the next slide. I'm going to skip this because it's indoor air quality. I wanted to spend a little time talking about this, but here's my contact information. If you are interested in learning about indoor air quality or would like to learn more or talk more about agricultural health, please, I'm always happy to entertain these conversations. It's a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey. That was a lot of really important and interesting information, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. I won't spend too much time here, so we can move right along and pass it on to Morgan to talk more about our Trouble in the Air report, as well as the connection between climate change and air quality, and leave us on some good, hopefully an angle of hope as well, and what we can do moving forward. So passing it right along to you, Morgan.
Great. Thanks so much, Angie. And thanks also to all the other speakers, Audrey and Corinne and Allie. I am really glad to have you all here and hear what you had to say too, because it sets me up greatly for what I want to talk about. So to introduce myself, my name is Morgan Folger. I'm the Clean Cars Campaign Director with Environment America Research and Policy Center. And we're a national federation of environmental groups across the country, including Environment Iowa Research and Policy Center. And then, as mentioned, I also am one of the authors of our Trouble in the Air report this year. So Renee, if you want to go to the next slide. And probably one more. Yep, so that's me, and this is our report. So our report, Trouble in the Air, Millions of Americans Breathed Polluted Air in 2018, shows that the air in our communities is not as clean as you might think or hope. And using the most recent data available from the Environmental Protection Agency, we found that in Iowa, Cedar Rapids suffered through 116 days of poor air quality due to air pollution in 2018. That's equal to almost 4 months of breathing dirty air that puts our health at risk. And no one should have to experience even 1 day of polluted air, let alone 116 days. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is some data, not just on Cedar Rapids, but other major areas throughout Iowa. And so our report looked at both ozone pollution and particulate matter pollution, which Audrey told us all about. And then we also were able to provide information on how many people were living in those areas that were impacted by those levels of air pollution. And to share a little bit of my own experience with air pollution, a couple summers ago, I had a respiratory attack myself on a bad air day. It was about 90 degrees out in a suburban neighborhood, and I was out knocking on doors to stop the rollbacks to our basic environmental laws. And my throat got tight, I started wheezing and could not catch my breath. And I have no history of asthma and healthy lungs. And so it was really scary. Definitely just one moment of time for me, as opposed to, you know, the hundreds of thousands of people who deal with these issues every single day. But I texted my friend Julie frantically to get advice so that I could get back to work. She has asthma and was hoping that she'd know what to do. And I was actually sitting on a bench near a busy roadway at the time, and she told me that I should move away from the road because the cars could be triggering my breathing problems. Ultimately, I recovered just fine, but each and every year there are tens of thousands of people who have their lives cut short from the adverse health impacts related to air pollution. And a big problem is our transportation sector. And I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So our air quality issues should concern every Iowan because research increasingly suggests there's no safe level of air pollution for us to breathe. This means that simply by inhaling, Iowans are at risk of heart disease, respiratory distress, worsened mental health, cancer, and so many more of the health impacts that Audrey talked about as well. And what's worse is for those in our communities who might be particularly vulnerable, like children, pregnant women, and the elderly, those impacts of air pollution can be especially pronounced. So the need for action is urgent because many air pollutants both threaten our health and fuel global warming. So the fossil fuels that are burned in our cars, our trucks, buses, and in power plants are huge contributors to global warming pollution. And now transportation in particular is the largest source in the United States, and the second largest source here in Iowa. And not only that, but these are also problems that feed on each other. So global warming will also make air pollution worse. As pollution traps more heat in the atmosphere, those higher temperatures make air quality worse. If you remember the slide Audrey had with the tailpipe pollution, and that one of the contributors was heat and sunlight, and that's how ozone is formed. So to protect our health, we need to fight for clean air. And so first and foremost, we have to stop burning fossil fuels and transition to 100% renewable energy. We have the technology to harness the power of the sun and the wind to power our homes, our cars, and our lives. And we also need to transition to electric cars, buses, and trucks. There's no question that we need cleaner vehicles on our roads, and there's no cleaner vehicle than an electric vehicle. So what can we all do to help reduce air pollution and fight climate change? If you go to the next slide. So there are some proactive things we can do, like move Iowa and our country towards 100% renewable energy. We also can transition to zero emission vehicles. So a great example, there's a picture in the bottom left here, is that Des Moines is moving towards electric transit buses. The Des Moines Area Transit Authority, or DART, has bought 7 electric buses. They were initially scheduled to roll out this summer and debut at the Iowa State Fair. So not sure if that will still go according to plan. But one of the things that was interesting about this particular case is they got creative with funding for the buses. They were able to combine their own funds as a transit agency with partnerships with the local utility, federal grant funding, and some money from the city to be able to make that transition. And this is a really important move to reduce harmful air pollution and fight climate change. And then we talked a little bit about what's going on at the federal level. So now more than ever, we need to protect and build upon the progress that we've already achieved under the Clean Air Act. The EPA needs to ensure that we have strong enforcement of the Clean Air Act and strengthen our ozone and particulate matter standards, including, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. But they're going the wrong direction. And during the coronavirus pandemic, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency released a new policy that would suspend the enforcement of key provisions of our nation's environmental laws. So that's putting our air, our water, and our health at the mercy of polluters. The whole framework of the Clean Air Act depends on that monitoring and reporting. And without that, we have no idea what those facilities are releasing into the air that we breathe. That's particularly true with the oil and gas industry. The refineries for oil and gas release millions of pounds of air pollution, including fugitive emissions or leaks that are against the law. And those would go undetected without stringent monitoring requirements. And then fracking operations across the country too involve several emission releasing components, from drill pads, compressor stations, pipelines, waste pits. And those are sometimes in close proximity to child care centers, nursing homes, and even hospitals. So this is definitely a reckless new policy, and we're working to organize attorney generals to make sure that they can stand up to the EPA and show that we do need to be enforcing our environmental and air quality laws. And we shouldn't be, letting facilities off the hook because of, coronavirus ate my homework type excuse. We never need more air pollution in our air, but especially not now when we're dealing with a respiratory virus that's become a pandemic. So this is all pretty scary, but right now we can urge Congress to use its oversight authority to ensure the safety of our air and water. And I know Angie's going to tell us more about some actions that we can take tonight to actually move towards a cleaner, greener future and help to protect our air. And I'll just close by saying, we can't choose whether or not to breathe, but we can choose to fight for clean air, and the health of our community depends on it. So thanks so much for having me. And you can go to the next slide, I think has my Twitter handle on it, and my email if you'd like to get in touch with questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Morgan. Okay, we have a couple questions right now, or a couple minutes right now for questions, pardon me. If anybody has a question for any of our speakers, you can, it says raise your hand. That was when this is going to be on Zoom, but you can just unmute yourself and ask, or type it in the chat if you would prefer.
Is it okay to comment?
Yes.
Okay, this is cutting. For some reason, my camera stopped working. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I'm allowing it. In any case, my comment is that I appreciate hugely what you're doing at Environment Iowa, especially in terms of drawing in young people, because you are the ones who are going to be dealing with this. My time on earth isn't as long as yours, and it is, it gives me hope when I see the kind of work that your organization does. And I just want to thank you for your thoroughness, and for the speakers you invited, including us. This is our hope. This is how we move forward, inch by inch. And so just thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be coordinating with Moms Clean Air Force at the same time.
Our privilege.
If no one else has questions or comments, I'd be interested to know, actually, Morgan, from the Trouble in the Air report, what other areas in the country were the worst, or particularly notable for poor air quality?
Yeah, so Iowa didn't make the top 10 list for the places where the most people were impacted by air pollution. California continually, is a really populous state and is a place that has some long-term air quality challenges. Definitely ranked on the top of the list of, those places that are at risk. So I didn't have the slide pulled up with our top 10, but let me grab that. So the 10 most populated areas that had more than 100 days of ozone pollution in 2018. So those include Phoenix in Arizona, Riverside, California, Las Vegas, Nevada, Salt Lake City, Utah, Fresno, California, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Bakersfield, California, Colorado Springs, Colorado, the Ogden Clearfield area in Utah, and the Provo-Orem area in Utah. So Utah also makes the list a few times. So those were places for ozone. And then for particulate matter pollution, you have Los Angeles, Riverside, California, San Diego, California, Cincinnati, Ohio, Austin, Texas, Fresno, California, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Bakersfield, California, McAllen, Texas, and Stockton, California.
A lot of California. I guess that's not too much of a surprise.
No.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's still a lot of oil and gas production there and a lot of people driving.
We could take one or two more questions if anybody else has a question.
Okay, I have a question. Not to anybody specifically. I'm not sure if I missed this, but a question that just kind of popped up into my head throughout this was, I was wondering what the biggest contributors of air pollution are in Iowa specifically, like what sectors, that sort of thing.
Well, I can take a crack at this for the ozone and particulate matter pollution that we covered in our report. So the volatile organic compounds that Audrey mentioned are one of the main ways that ozone forms in the atmosphere. So for Iowa, the biggest source of volatile organic compounds is transportation and contributes 32%. And then for the contribution to global warming pollution, transportation is also the largest source in Iowa. And then for nitrous oxides for Iowa, transportation contributes 67%. So for all the data I've looked at, transportation is the biggest challenge and one of the first things we need to address.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll need to move on from questions now so we can wrap on time. But as Morgan was mentioning earlier, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, now we'll have an opportunity to take a quick action to help us move towards a cleaner and better, safer future. And this has to do with the EPA rollbacks that have been mentioned a couple of times. So if you, I know we're all on our computers right now, you can go to environmentiowa.org. On the very front page, there's a Take Action button that will take you to this petition, which will tell our congresspersons that they need to use their oversight to keep the EPA enforcing these key environmental protections for our air and our water. So if everyone can sign that petition tonight and share it with at least 5 other folks who can sign as well and hopefully share as well, we can have a pretty big impact with our representatives hearing from us and knowing that we are still paying attention to this kind of thing and we do want to see them do better. So if everyone can do that, again, it's just environmentiowa.org and then the Take Action button right there. We'll move on to the next slide so I can also let you know what's happening next for this campaign. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, next week is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is an exciting deal, but we're not able to come together to celebrate this in person, which is why we are hosting our hashtag Iowa Virtual Earth Day in coordination with all of these partners that you can see here on the slide. And for this week, we're hosting a couple different events. We have a launch event on Saturday, which is the 18th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Time. We'll have our 50 Actions for 50 Earth Days launch events, or 50 Years of Earth Day launch events. We're hoping to get 50 activists in Iowa to commit to take 50 actions for the climate, 50 social distancing friendly actions for the climate over the course of the Earth Week to continue to spread awareness and to work towards that better and cleaner, greener future. And then on Wednesday, on Earth Day itself, we'll be holding a virtual Earth Day rally, and that's April 22nd on Wednesday at 5 to 6:30 p.m. and that will be held through Zoom. So you can find these in our on our Facebook page. We'll have Facebook events, but I will also share right now in the chat a Google form through which you can RSVP for these events and make sure that you are given the correct information and links and anything else that you need to participate. I will copy and paste that right now so that y'all can open up that form and RSVP for any of the events that you would like to join. Please do join us. This is an exciting way that we can still get together for this really important cause, even in these crazy times that we're in. So then my very last thing that I want to say is to please stay updated and stay connected with us. These are our respective social media handles, how you can find the Climate Defenders campaign and Environment Iowa on these different platforms. So if anybody is here who did not RSVP, I'll be sending out a follow-up email, and you could send your email address in the chat right now to be sure that you get that. That would be great before you head out. Otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. Especially thank you to our speakers. You all provided some really awesome context and insight into this issue that's just so critical now more than ever and will continue to be. So anybody has last minute questions, you can send them in a chat, send them to the email addresses that have been shown to you. And everyone has my email address, so if you need to contact me for a speaker's contact information, you're welcome to do so. But thank you everybody so much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Thanks, Angie. Everyone be well. Stay healthy.
And stay safe and healthy.
Oh, and Angie.